Good afternoon, guys, and thank you for the presentation. We're going to continue the discussion on electric batteries and critical materials dependency. We'll start off by viewing the table of contents. Is it moving? No. Okay. Wait. Yeah, sorry. We'll start off by looking at the table of contents. We'll go over a quick summary of the US, China, and European Union dependency, then look at, we'll delve into a bit of the discussion part, and then we'll open this for questions for debate. So to look at the dependency part a bit. Okay, I don't know why this is doing this, but yeah, okay. So let's look at the climate dilemma for starters. So we're seeing that there's a transition to electrical vehicles, but and this is necessary to reduce the greenhouse gas consumptions, but at the same time, we see that electrical vehicles require like 6 times more critical minerals than combustion vehicles, and this increases and there's an increasing demand to push for renewable energy and zero emission goals, but at the same time, we're seeing a geographical concentration of the resources with the critical minerals industry being concentrated in a few countries only, and this is creating a lot of socio-political dependencies. And then there's a supply and demand mismatch where the supply for critical minerals is increasing, but the demand for critical minerals is increasing, but the supply cannot match up. And then this leads to multiple geopolitical risks, which we see in the US-China EU dependency. And because we're seeing that nations are competing for this, and this is exposing a lot of vulnerabilities in the energy transitions. And then there are a number of trade-offs. So firstly, when we look at the environmental and social risks, we see that mining leads to habitat destructions, water consumption, and toxic waste generation. And when we look at the recycling costs, we see that there's not enough infrastructure to lead to recycling. And it's, again, difficult to meet the demand for recycling. So this brings us to the core dilemma, which is that EVs are essential for reducing carbon emissions and controlling climate change. But their production relies on resource-intensive, geopolitically fraught, and environmentally challenging processes, which brings us to the US-EU-China dependency. So let's start off with China. We see that China is leading the supply for critical minerals and electric vehicle batteries and other technologies, and it has control over, for example, like 90% of the rare earth processing material, 70% of cobalt refining, and 50% of lithium processing. And this is due to China's vertically integrated supply chain system, which includes the BRI. And both the US and EU rely heavily on China to meet imports, and this creates a dependency and vulnerability. And this brings us to the US-China rivalry, where we see that high dependencies on Chinese-controlled supply chain exposes the US to potential disruptions, and the US is seeking to reduce its reliance on China through its import policies and the IRA. And when we look at EU, we're seeing that it needs to secure access to critical minerals while navigating the geopolitical competition between US and China. And it's aiming to do this by maintaining a friendly relation with China, but at the same time partnering with other countries and increasing its own production. So at the crux of it, we see that China has the advantage where it controls the raw materials and processing, placing it in a commanding position, while the EU lacks significant domestic production or processing capabilities to meet the demand, so it kind of really relies on China. And the US is trying to reduce its dependency through domestic production and partnerships with allies and other trade agreements. So when we look at China, we see that through economic diplomacy, it's established free trade agreements, and then again, their vertical integration is allowing it to reduce reliance on foreign suppliers, and they have a lot of strategic planning and investment. The US is particularly focusing on the IRA to increase incentives for domestic production, and they're participating in raw material diplomacy and really focusing on investment in domestic production. The EU, on the other hand, is caught in the middle. It's trying to maintain its friendly relations with China while trying to reduce its dependency on it. And again, there's a lot of strategic autonomy, and and they're really focusing on environmental regulations to reduce carbon emissions, which...
Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to kick off our discussions to our thoughts on the paper, what we thought the paper did well, maybe what it was missing, and also a discussion on like the wider debate and the wider issues covered in the paper. So on the left, we have the same table that we saw in the presentation earlier, where we can see the extent to which each mineral is, the extent to which the EU and the US is dependent on a limited number of suppliers for each critical raw material. And then on the right, we have a sort of a lift under the bonnet where we can see exactly who the supplier is. And the implication would be, for example, that the UK or South Korea is more of a friendly supplier to the US and the EU than, say, China. Give the next slide, please. And so we've picked out one example just to sort of illustrate this to you guys. So an example of cobalt oxides and hydroxides, we can see this index shows us that the EU is really dependent on China, whereas the US has done a much better job of diversifying its supply and gets, well, as far as we know, not much at all from China. We thought this was a great aspect of the paper and very nicely illustrates it, but we would say that there's only essentially a direct link that is shown and not any sort of second-hand effects. So if we imagine a very plausible situation, as we found out in the presentation, where China and the EU are in some kind of conflict or have a quarrel over something that isn't maybe particularly important but still aren't agreeing with each other, it's quite likely they might restrict what they export to the EU. If they do this, Finland and Belgium, as members of the EU, who make up 57% of the US's supply, may well think, oh, we're going to serve our domestic market instead of the US. Next slide, please. So what we might see through a second-hand effect, and that isn't covered in any detail in the paper as well, is supply chain nationalism, which even if you have states like the US who are doing a slightly better job than the EU of moving away from sort of the control of China and supplying these things, if they also still have allies who haven't taken the same steps, they might get hit themselves. And this sort of supply chain nationalism is very plausible prospect and something we only saw a few years ago in COVID-19. So our point is the paper does a great job of illustrating these direct effects, but when you look in even more detail, the fragilities are even worse, essentially. Next slide, please. So the paper touches upon a little bit of what the US and the EU should do, and we've collated some other policy suggestions from a broader range of literature. So the literature on this topic overwhelmingly agrees, as does the paper we've had presented to us today, that improving recycling capabilities really is the #1 priority with regards to like a policy response to trying to deal with this. And the logic behind this is obvious. If you can recycle more of the raw materials, you won't need to bring in as much. Another policy suggestion we quite liked was to recover raw materials from waste in calcination. And so when waste is burnt, essentially, one paper's found that they can actually retrieve some of these raw materials from this if there's more investment into this technology. One paper suggested, particularly for the US, to focus its research and development investment on the supply chain as a whole with regards to getting these critical materials into the US, whereas more recently they had been focused on just specific aspects of the supply chain. And the final one is, if the US and EU have exhausted all their domestic solutions with regards to finding more raw materials, it's been suggested that they can invest more in partnership with friendly states into looking into whether friendly states might have more raw materials than they first thought. Thanks, Charles.
and now we're going to be delving into the critique of this paper. It's basically going to contain some additional points that we found of relevance to the context, and also a couple of topics of contention that we found of huge interest. So if we're going to start with the first point, which is the electric vehicles in the global transition paradigm. So as explained previously by Professor Bruno, Leena, and Charlie, that electric vehicles require a lot of materials and a lot of minerals for its production, which is kind of reminiscent to what was happening when extracting oil and gas in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution up until this day. The only problem that we're kind of facing right now is giving legitimacy to the electric vehicles within the global transition, because it's usually associated with green transition, associated with environmentalism, while at the same time it has almost the same impact. And you have policies such as the ones proposed by the EU, for instance, like for the first Fit for 55 deal, that they require by 2035 the end of sale of the cars that are emitting CO2. The same goes to the United States, but they've set this in even a shorter time period, which is set by 2030. Although this is nice in broad scheme, but in general, it's putting even more demand on those materials, because you have the demand on lithium increasing. It's going to be increasing 40 times by 2040. Same goes to cobalt, graphite, which would maybe increase the extractivism and accelerate it, and then we go to the same extractivist regime that we've been dealing with oil and gas beforehand. And as highlighted by also Professor Bruno in the beginning, that these minerals are mainly concentrated in some limited amount of countries, such as Morocco when it comes to phosphate, but also some other critical materials that are going to be used in the electric vehicles production, such as cobalt, which 48% of it is concentrated in Democratic Republic of Congo. You have 23% of graphite being concentrated in Brazil. Same goes to lithium, where 36% is concentrated in Chile, and the list goes on. So this has impact on the global south when it comes to socio-ecological impacts. And we were diving deep a little bit in terms of how this would happen, taking into consideration what happened beforehand when it came to oil and gas and extraction. So usually it happens that the international monetary system is used by global north countries when competition intensifies and they want to kind of enter the market of the global south to extract these materials. They utilize international monetary system. And by that, the global south countries, they adopt short-term export-oriented policies. So they export their natural resources in exchange of limited amount of liquid foreign currencies in order to navigate their economic challenges and financial challenges. But this leaves them with everlasting ecological crises. And because of that, you would find that there is ecological hierarchy and currency hierarchy and kind of dependency created, just like what happened with oil and gas extraction in the beginning. And when we have a market like electric vehicles started getting a little bit global, this leaves the playing ground for multinational corporations from the global north into conquering the global south through global value chains expansion. And this leads to exploiting of labor, like was highlighted by Swandi, where you have inhumane working conditions, such as the cobalt mines in Democratic Republic of Congo. And this also paves the way for more exploitation when it comes to recycling, because we've mentioned recycling and circular economy, but also we were referencing Gianpietro here that recycling or circular economy would require other inputs to do this recycling. So you'd have to abide by the natural ecological process to generate primary resources and then take into consideration the absorption capacity of the natural sinks. So in general, it won't be giving any kind of space for global transition. And even if transition happened in a way because of electric vehicles would kind of reduce emissions a little bit in broader scheme of things, it's just going to happen also in one part of the world who's going to be able to manufacture the electric vehicles. And because of that, we move to, we move to the last point of our critique, which is the lack of global governance, because as explained earlier, you can see how the EU is adopting policies in order to get competitive advantage, and then you'd see how China is doing the same thing, and then the USA doing the same thing as well, and every country is trying to retaliate in order to gain competitive advantage. But in order to kind of regulate all of that, you would need strong global regulatory body that would be enforcing the rule of law across all, so nobody steps over the line. well, this doesn't happen, probably it won't, but I think, or we actually think, that if this doesn't happen, then what would hold such countries or governments accountable? Because, because as things stand right now, you have, for instance, WTO, the only probably governmental body that has maybe the authority to instill some regulations that could be abided by other countries. But if we're going to be honest about that, if the country is dominating the market and the playing field are the ones who are establishing those entities, well, you know, who's going to be enforcing them? Because they're going to be controlling the market and they're setting the regulations, which is giving them just a little bit more legitimacy. It's not going to be holding them accountable. And no, I don't want to be exceeding. I need an internship. Anyway, so that marks the end of our presentation. We have discussion questions for you if we want to delve more into this discussion. And you're going to find attached list of references if anyone wants to expound more on this research. Thank you.
So you can have a first round of reactions, Bruno. Yeah. And then we open the floor.
Okay, thank you so much for the comments. And there are many points that you raised that I agree with. I just want to discuss, because I've already spoken too much, one of the points that you raised, which is EV, global change, nationalism. I'm not sure which term exactly you use, but I think that's a very interesting point. But I would say that it is true on a case-by-case basis, because it depends on the relation between a state and big private companies. And in some countries, I would say the state may have the power to impose decisions or strong restrictions on private companies. In some other countries, it's not the case. So although you are absolutely right that the two tables present just aggregate information and rough information that should be investigated much more into details, nonetheless, I am not sure that in case of a huge crisis, a global one, the EU authorities, even with the support of EU member states, would have the power to impose to private European companies to redirect their export to the European market. I think it's highly debatable. I'm not saying that I have a strong conviction about what would happen, because we are more in terms of political fictions and political scenarios. But I'm not convinced that it would happen for sure. That's all I'm saying. For China, it's a different matter, because even private companies are so much related to the state in many ways. For instance, there is always different members of the Chinese political party within their board, executive board, so the state has always a strong control even on private companies, and they can, I would say, give instructions to them to do something or not to do something. We have seen many Chinese CEOs who have disappeared for 1 month or 2 months before reappearing and making statements saying that they would follow the Chinese policy more obediently. So you have a special relations between the private sector and the state in China that does not exist elsewhere. And even in the US, you could see that during the first Trump presidency, and even during the Biden's presidency, there were big companies who say, no, we won't follow your policy, and we refuse to change, for instance, substantially our presence in China, and we won't reshore our activities from China to the US. And Trump had no, I would say, even with all the political might that he may have as a president of the of the US, he could not force them to do what he wanted them to do. I think you raised a strong point, but it needs to be more discussed on a case-by-case basis. And I don't see, to finish with, the EU having this kind of power on private companies because I think it is more diverse. There are different countries with different interests. Within them, there are different companies which have different interests. Take the example of France. You have two big car companies, Stellantis and Renault. Stellantis is not a French company as such, but more a European one or a global one if you include their US activities. They have opposite views regarding the EU policy and the potential EU sanction next year, because they don't have exactly the same interest, although they are based in France and they don't have the same relation with the French state. So I would say that in all countries, European countries, you will find the same kind of situation. In particular, if you include all the actors, not only the car makers, but the chemical companies, where you have global companies which are very strong, like Siemens in Germany, to just name one company among many of them. It's such a diverse world of interest that that is one of the weaknesses of the EU, is to precisely to create a kind of agreement between all these different actors and make sure that they more or less agree on an industrial policy. For the rest, I think that it is important to open the floor to all of you and discuss collectively the other questions. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. So let's open the floor. We start here. We have 35 minutes for this.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Enzo. I'm from Brazil. My question is regarding when you argue that China has the control of the critical minerals. It's mostly like a clarification question. So I want to understand if when you say that they have the control, it's because they have in their territory, like China mainland, or you're also like adding to your analysis the countries where they have influence, for instance, because of the Belt and Road, because of trade routes, because of like ownership of mining companies in African countries, for instance. That's my question.
Let's have at least 3 questions.
Hello, I'm Marie-Noël from Germany. And you said in your presentation that a Swedish champion and a French company are struggling to produce EVs at a large scale. And I was wondering why. Is this due to the lack of infrastructure or because there is a supply of critical minerals? And then I was wondering, because you said that there was this trend that the companies offshore their activities and then try to dominate the global value chain, and that this trend is revising because now companies also invest at the very first step of the global value chain in mines, and I was wondering if there's more evidence that this trend is changing.
Hi, Timon from Germany. In another presentation, we saw that like the financial ownership is basically on the US side, while the manufacturing ownership is mostly by China, and this is the competition basically from a real and a monetary perspective. And if we now would think about the dependency that you just showed to like very few countries, that could actually make create a potential for them to grow more, but because of their oligopolies in that kind of way. If they would climb up the global value chain, would this change something in the monetary hierarchy in this kind of way of the trade with dollars, for instance?
Have a first round of responses.
Yes. When I was talking about China and the strength of China, I included not only the the industrial companies within China, which are very strong and are where you have the largest battery makers and all the main companies that are supplying components to the battery makers. You have also now one of the largest car makers, and you have also very strong chemical companies and electronic companies. So you have the big names in China. But China has also not only influence, but direct control of many mining sites all over the world, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia also. I talked about in the Sulawesi, which is part of Indonesia. So they have invested everywhere. The Belt and Road Initiative was used to establish all these political and trade and industrial links to create this huge network that they have now. And I think that they are much stronger in this sense than the US or the EU, precisely because it is a systematically organized policy that combines the interest of the Chinese companies and the strategic interest of the state. And I don't see the same coherence and obstinacy on the US or European side. Well, for political reasons, I believe, it would demand a lot of discussion whether, for instance, the coming US president has a strategic view of the American interest, or only the views of, or if it defends only the interest of part of the US capital that decided to support him, like the oil and gas, for instance. Surprisingly, he disregarded the US mining industry. He did not support them a lot, apart from oil and gas. I mean, for the rest, he was never very supportive of developing the mining activities within the US. And it is only the Biden administration that tried to have a systematic economic diplomacy, visiting Africa many times to try to make trade agreement with some African countries to supply the US with minerals and everything, like the EU did, but not with a lot of success. So that's my response for China, and I think it is very clear in Chinese case. For your question regarding the French automobile companies, they were initially, at least Stellantis, very reluctant to invest in electric cars. Stellantis, I mean Peugeot and Citroën at the time, because Stellantis is very recent, they defended the diesel motor and the diesel car until the end, until really the EU and the French government had decided that they would ban the diesel engine very soon. Like many German companies too, because they were very strong in this part, so they wanted to continue as long as possible. While Renault had a different policy, and they were willing to develop the electric car more easily, and they invested sooner than Stellantis in the electric car. So that's why they have now a different view on what should be done. Although now Stellantis is forced to also invest in the electric car. They have not the strongest model, and they have included a Chinese car maker to provide them with some electric vehicles within Europe. So again, it shows that private interest is very different from national interest. You may have private companies that play against the interest of their country, and they don't care about it. For instance, many car makers in Europe have said that those who are opposed to any kind of industrial policy. And why do they support the single market policy? It's because they want to be free to make any agreement with any private companies across the world, whatever its nationality. And they have no trouble to make purchase agreements with Chinese suppliers, as long as these suppliers don't dominate them and force them to accept higher prices. That's all they want. For the rest, they can buy from China with no problem. And that's why also it is so difficult to have a common policy within Europe. I would say a more proactive policy in Europe, beyond the belief in the virtue of the single market, because then it would mean that there would be a strong political command within the EU, which does not exist as such, and more, I would say, a common interest between countries, European countries, which again does not exist as much as such. What the EU tries to do is to build commonality thanks to big research projects that would develop European technology, European project for the future, that would orient the private interest towards a common industry. But this is not enough, I would say, and it does not mean that any progress of the European technology and product will benefit European companies too. That there would be strong private companies that would use this technology to develop activities within Europe, for instance. They can use this technology to develop their offshore activities and not produce within Europe. That's also a possibility. Now, for the financial aspect, I don't know if I got your question clearly, but what we know from the past is that the major currency, and Bruno will know more about it than me, each dominant currency was always linked to the main source of energy. So the dollar, the US dollar, was dominant and it still is, although its hegemony is now strongly questioned by, again, China and other countries. But it was linked to oil and gas, like the sterling pound was linked previously to more to coal. So there are people who are saying that, for instance, Michel Aglietta has published different articles about it, saying that the attack against the US dollar is also because there is an energy transition. And if there is a new, really new energy, maybe the renewable energy or a combination of new energies that imposed as an alternative to oil and gas and coal also, because coal is still important, then it will open the way for a new currency that we don't know if it can be the Chinese renminbi, but China is dominating the market for renewable energy by far. So they may be the one who have a stronger possibility to really replace the US dollar with a different currency. And we all know that China has taken a lot of initiatives to, and not only China, all the enemies of the US that were sanctioned by the US because they were using the dollar, are creating an alternative payment system, and they want to probably create in the future a basket currency that would circumvent the hegemony of the dollar. And I think that it is credible. They can do it. It's more a political question than anything else, because these countries may also have disagreement between them on big issues. So it's not for sure that they will have enough in common to build a currency. It's not easy. But they can, I think, easily build an alternative payment system, which would be already very important to undermine the domination of the US dollar. But let's see what happens, yes.
Hello, I'm Romain from France. Thank you for the presentation. I had a question regarding a number you presented. You mentioned in the presentation. You said that the recycling capacities in Europe must increase by 45 times the current sizes in 2050. What are the capacities taken into account for such a number? Like, do we convert existing capacities to electric, and therefore we need 45 times more recycling capacities, or do we talk about an alternative scenario, like a sobriety one? Because I've read sometimes that for the French case, if we convert all the cars to the thermal cars to electric, we need 10 to 15 nuclear reactors only dedicated to recharging batteries. So that's a highly improbable scenario. So what's the basic scenario expected for sobriety in 2050? Thanks.
Hello, I'm Reshma. I'm from Bangladesh. So my question is about sustainability. So considering the environmental and social challenges to new mining projects in US and Europe, how can government balance the need for critical mineral extraction with sustainable practices and community concerns? Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, so as you explained, like for the case of Indonesia, China, of course, is the main buyer of a lot of their critical raw materials, particularly nickel, and they've reached in and kind of helped structure this industry. But some years back when Indonesia banned exports of raw nickel, it was the EU that brought kind of charges against them in the World Trade Organization. That they were violating the kind of like free trade rules. And so my question is essentially about convergent interests between these different players, because I think you've talked about how like the competing interests they have, but it seems that there's also maybe a shared logic or shared interest in the nature of these kind of extractive relations. So yeah, essentially the question is, what do you see, are there convergent interests? Like, what are they and how are they being articulated? Or is my reading of that right or not?
And then we have a last.
Thank you for all these questions. For the recycling scenarios in Europe, my presentation was based on the EU publications and their estimates. So I'm not an engineer, so I cannot judge the accuracy of these scenarios, but I believe that they are in line with what the EU official targets are for the electric vehicles and renewable energy. I don't think that the EU has any strong policy in terms of sobriety. And that's the main problem, because the real solution to climate change is really sobriety and the decrease in energy consumption. And for instance, as you said, the solution is not to convert all the combustion engine vehicles into electric vehicles. Well, that would curb some of the pollution, of course, but create new ones. Maybe less air pollution, but instead more pollution of the land and the water. So I don't see, in the end, it's a trade-off, but I don't see any real progress if we just switch from one main source of pollution to another. The real solution is to have less cars on roads, that's for sure, and to use more collective means of transport. So the solution is more towards a revolution in mobility rather than converting one kind of car to another kind of cars. So that's not what the EU is doing. It's not its main priority, although there are some policies in terms of mobility, but it is not presented as the priority for global change and energy transition for sure. So most of your concerns regarding the increase of nuclear energy, at least for France, is right. That's a part of the French policy to develop the nuclear industry. From what Macron said, not only the big nuclear power plant, but also smaller decentralized nuclear power plants. So I'm very worried about what will happen with more nuclear power plants, because they have the same, I would say, dangers in terms of not only potential accident, but also security concerns about what could happen if some people decide to attack these smaller dispersed power plants everywhere on the territory. So that is an additional problem that is attached to any idea of green capitalism, where nothing really changes. There is an ever-growing market of different consumer products without any, I would say, stabilization of the level of production and demand, and any degrowth and decarbonizing of the economy that is really seriously implemented. Now, regarding what you said about sustainability, well, all these policies are presented as sustainable policies. They are all made in the name of sustainability, but as I said, when you look at the impact on the local people, I believe that it is a disaster, precisely because extractive industries have never been green, and they have never really benefited the local people, although they are creating jobs, and that is one of the reasons why the extractive industry in some cases can have the support of the local communities. It does not benefit all the people in the neighborhood. And even if at the short term jobs are improving the living conditions of the people, on the medium and long term they will suffer from pollution and very negative aspects of the mining industries. So if there was any possibility to have green mining, I would be more optimistic, and there is a growing literature about green mining. I read some of the papers. I am not an expert on the topic. I should know much more before having any serious opinion, but I believe from my readings of a few papers that it is more greenwashing than green mining. Even if you take, for instance, the financial statements of Volkswagen, they produce kind of green reports where they publish the quantity of water that they use in their plants. And even according to them, their consumption of water has increased these last years instead of decreasing, which should be the case. And for the mining industries, not only they use a lot of energy, a lot of water in areas where people don't have enough water for their personal consumption or for agriculture, for instance. They are using the water that people need, and they are polluting the water, and they also produce a lot of toxic waste. which in the European context is supposed to be taken care of. For instance, in France, there is a project to develop, there is a lithium company in the middle of France, and they want to transport the waste something like 100 kilometers to a place where it will be landfilled, but supposedly in a safe way, but we just don't know about it. In the meantime, they will cut all the forest that is around the mine, and there will be a lot of disturbance of the environment. That is just one case that I know, but I suppose that in Bangladesh they would not take all these precautions because for the lack of laws or for the lack of enforcement of existing laws. And I have never seen in the Global South mining companies making serious efforts to circumvent, decrease the impact of their activities. Usually there are a lot of promises that are not respected. So I would say that's why I'm very concerned with extractivism and the boom in the mining industry, because I know what will happen, unfortunately. That's for sure. I forgot your question. It was linked to yeah. I remember. Well, in the case of Indonesia, Indonesia is one of the rare big countries in the south that has a bargaining power with global companies and global powers. But again, they don't use it for good reasons. Behind the scene, you have big Indonesian conglomerates that make agreement with other conglomerates from China or elsewhere to extract nickel and other ores from Indonesia. Well, they want to refine it in Indonesia to increase the added value and make sure that Indonesia will get more from its minerals than simply exporting raw materials. So in the sense, it's a good move. Again, if it is done in an environmental friendly way, which, as I just said, is not usually the case. And second, if it is to provide electric cars that can be used in Indonesia to resolve the mobility issues that are so huge in Indonesia. I don't know if some of you have ever been in Jakarta. You just can't move because there are so many traffic jams everywhere that you can just go in one day from one point to another after 3 or 4 or 5 hours and try to return at the end of the day. That's all you can do because it's just impossible to move from point A to B and then to C and to D. More than one move is too much. So there is a huge need for collective transport and mobility in Indonesia. I don't believe that the export of even refined minerals will be for the sake of Indonesian, but will be for export to other countries. And the revenues that will be made from export, I don't believe that it will be then used for the benefit of the local population. So they will have only the bad effects of extractivism without any serious benefits. That's what I think. But then you're right, it can be exported to Europe, and Europe can use it if they don't care about the fact that in Indonesia, it's more Chinese companies that have extracted and refined the minerals in joint ventures with Indonesian companies. That can be done because the EU already imports a lot of palm oil from Indonesia. Even in France, there was a refinery near Marseille that used Indonesian palm oil to produce so-called biofuel. When you know the destructive impact of palm oil for the environment, you don't believe that it is really a good move. But it was this refinery was built with EU subsidies. So that shows also the value of many statements made by the EU that they are going green. Well, if you include palm oil in green, yes, you can say that they are going green, but not for good reasons. Yeah.
So maybe one or two final questions. We have one there, one here, and then, okay, maybe.
Hi, my name is Nikhil. I'm from India. So I mean, in the presentation you talked about the US cutting down on EV subsidies. So my question is around the same, like, what is the justification of EV subsidies if those are to be given to the richest of the richest people who can afford a car worth 60,000 euros, one? And second, I'm coming from a poor country like India. So last year, we spent about $2 billion on subsidies on renewable energy, whereas we spent $1 billion on subsidies on electric vehicles. So the marginal gains from renewable energy where we spend $2 billion will be much more better for environment than funding the rich with such fancy cars which cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So what's the justification there for EVs?
Hi, I'm Antoine from France. Since you mentioned sobriety, I wanted to know, do you think sobriety regarding minerals would make the EU less competitive in the transport sector, in the automobile sector? Because like it was an opportunity for growth for EU to transition to this EV sector. So yeah, I wanted to know your approach to deal with the dilemma of sobriety versus competitiveness in Europe.
Great. And then the very last one, because the other speaker already arrived.
Hi, I'm Lucien from France and the UK. I had a question. You mentioned when talking about car manufacturers' perspective on their role in the global production network as architects rather than being directly involved in them. You said the return to imperialism, and I just wanted to get a clarification on that, as in where was it gone? Was it gone during the 80s and the 90s, imperialism? Where is it coming back from? And in relation to that, is it related to potentially a falling rate of profit for Western companies like it was in the 70s and 80s when the US companies in particular sort of decided to launch this effort into globalization and opening up?
That's a very huge question. Yeah. Okay, I try to be as brief as possible. Now, to start with the last question, I was just saying that imperialism started with the emergence of global companies that were exploiting natural resources before manufacturing. And the big ones precisely were in the energy sector and other minerals. And then I would say the development of manufacturing later on made imperialism, I would say, not only in the natural resources activity, but diversified its interest in the very different activities. But the mining industry has never disappeared, of course. I'm just saying that with the electric vehicles and batteries, there is a renewal and probably more money and power that will be invested in the mining industry. And that makes it more, I would say, powerful to bargain with other segments of the value chains and other big global companies for I would say, to get a higher share of profit for them. So it's an internal fight, I would say, or rivalry between different fractions of capital that is happening now. Again, it is a kind of return to the origin, in the sense that the natural resources and the mining activities, especially at the digital age, are not fashionable at all. They are not considered as the future of the economy, which I think is wrong. Even in the age of dematerialization and digitalization of so many activities, if you look at Amazon or any other global company in the digital economy, you find behind the scene a lot of material activities and very traditional activities, and the industry is always there. Now, regarding India and why the government has decided to subsidize the electric cars, at the start the idea is that if you want to have a mass market, initially you need to support the new activities, and subsidies are always used to initiate at least the first steps of this growing market. It can be with direct subsidies, but it can be in many other in other ways. For instance, usually the state also provides a lot of infrastructure for free to many private companies. It happens everywhere, and because the electric vehicles are initially more expensive than traditional vehicles, to reduce the gap, governments have given subsidies to potential buyers. And in France, until the end of the year, it's around 4,000 euros. If the French government has decided, it's not a European decision, to subsidize more cars that are made within Europe, to try to discriminate Chinese and other foreign cars, electrical cars. Now, the problem with the subsidies is that they are given to all consumers within a country. So it does not, as the way it has been done, discriminate between rich and poor consumers. And you're right, it should target more the poor people. In fact, not so poor, because in India, if you buy a car, you are not poor usually, even if it is a traditional combustion engine car. Poor people, they just can't buy any kind of vehicles, or maybe motorcycles, but no more. And even a motorcycle is a huge progress for them. But China has also invented electric motorcycles and scooters, and it works very well. And I was surprised 10 years ago when I first visited Kunming, for instance, in the south of China. There were already electric motorcycles everywhere, to the point that I could not hear them coming. So I was a bit surprised. While in France and the other countries, even in Thailand or other Southeast Asian countries, where motorcycles may be the main vehicle that people use, they were traditional motorcycles and not electric ones. Nonetheless, you can have subsidies that target the low entry vehicles for people who don't have a lot of money. In France, for instance, after the yellow jacket movement, the government had decided that anyone that has low revenue and using a very old car can have an additional subsidy to buy an electric car. And some people used it to do it. So it is totally possible that the Indian government could have, I would say, channel the subsidies only to people who have low revenues to buy small electric vehicles. But they did not do it for political reasons, that's all. Now, from the supply side, as I said, the car companies, they started and they gave priority to big electric cars. First, because this is what most consumer wants. The so-called sport utility vehicles, they are much larger cars and much, I would say, heavier cars than the previous cars that were sold in Europe or even in the US, the so-called sedan segment market, which is smaller and lighter. But because these SUVs have a higher profit margin, they want, and they are already more expensive than the other kind of cars, they thought that by starting with electric SUVs, which are sold with a very high price, usually more than 35, or nowadays you can have 40,000 euros, then they could make a higher profit margin. And because these cars are sold to people who are more affluent, they would have consumers. So it was not risky and much more profitable. Now the real challenge for them is to produce affordable electric cars for people who have much lower revenues. And they are just starting to do it. The difficulty for them, for French companies, for instance, is to produce these cars in France or at least within Europe because of the cost of labor, but also energy and different reasons. They think it's more profitable to produce them elsewhere. Although Renault is marketing cars with the label made in France and produced in France to convince people to buy them. India could easily do it too because it has the technological capacity to do it, but they have made different choices.